Hello everyone and welcome back into the final segment of the day here on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. And for our final segment of the day, we're talking a little bit more about the Sunday Night Football game from a fantasy standpoint, because there could be a lot at stake in this one, a lot of talent between these two teams from that perspective. So without further ado, let's jump right into it. Starting off the Bucs side of things, we already talked about this multifaceted offense. Despite the fact that they're down one of their top receivers, a lot of unsung heroes have stepped up for in the past 2 weeks, and that has really led to this team climbing the standings in the NFC South. And I feel like, I feel like a lot of the Bucs' success does still predicate itself on the connection between Baker and Mike Evans, but I do feel like these two players who I did say you might want to avoid this week just because A, it's a high-stakes match, but B, I don't necessarily know if some of their success throughout the year will continue. I do feel like they still can provide for this team in this setting. So without further ado, let's jump right into the Bucs side of things from a fantasy standpoint. And I feel like the two players are obvious in terms of who you might want to start in Baker and Mike Evans. Let's start off with Baker. He's my personal fantasy football QB, so I have a lot of love for him and what he's been able to do this season in a fantasy setting. And I feel like these past couple of weeks have shown the best of a confident Baker Mayfield in the NFL. Because when he's playing this confident brand of football, he's really bringing out the best in everyone. And that's really led to a surge in these underrated stars here on the Bucs really shining. And so that's why I feel he's a no-brainer for a lot of players in a fantasy setting for these later stages. And then from a Mike Evans standpoint, what can we say about him? Because he has been one of the most consistent fantasy performance, as Tata Learner says, is Bucky healthy. I'm not necessarily certain. I do know that he's been battling an injury for quite some time. And we'll talk about if he's in this game, how important he will be. But ultimately, that does kind of change things in my mind a little bit. Talking about this team from a fantasy standpoint, should he not play? But I do think from this perspective, if he does play, he still will have a lot more importance than people think. Even though getting into the sits here for the Bucs, I do think he's not going to have as huge an impact as fantasy owners would like. And getting into the sits is kind of hard to pick two players or several players who would have to sit or avoid in a fantasy perspective from the Bucs, just because this is a team that does rely a lot on their two weapon stars. But ultimately, these guys, I don't necessarily know if you would place too much trust in from a fantasy playoff perspective just yet. They're two young guys who I do believe have bright futures in this offense and have proven to be underrated hidden gems in a fantasy perspective this season. But ultimately, in this moment, I do feel like these two players might lose a little bit of their luster just because of the high-stakes nature of fantasy football playoffs. Jalen McMillan, let's start with him. Very underrated tight end. I love this guy, especially in third and short situations, in the middle areas of the field, definitely in crossing routes as well, especially in the red zone. I feel like he can have a huge impact on this game. They're definitely going to go to him a lot in short yard situations, where they feel like they can get him open and scheme him open. As Tackler also mentioned that Bucky is not on the injury report, much like what I thought. I do believe that he still does have a minor injury, but he should be good to go for this one. But talking about McMillan a little bit before we get into Bucky here, I do feel like this is an awkward sit just because he technically is the wide receiver 2 in this offense from the way he's been playing. But in this moment, I feel like it's going to come down to your last-minute decision-making and analysis of certain players and their matchups. And even though this could potentially be an interesting matchup here for McMillan, where he could be receiving a lot more targets than expected should the Cowboys, much like I think they will, key in on Mike Evans, I do feel like a lot of people might want a little bit more depth at the wide receiver position because they know the wide receiver position could be a lot more pivotal than other positions in this setting. And so that's why I feel like Jalen McMillan might not even be a flex option to most people and might be someone you might want to avoid overall, at least in this setting, because he does still add value, but I'm not necessarily certain you would place that much value on him in this situation. And then Bucky Irving, a lot of people love him. I still love him as a fantasy running back, and I hope he continues to improve. But in this setting, against this Cowboys run defense especially, I feel like Bucky is definitely not someone who you rely upon in a very weak running back position because you're going to have to make a lot more tight decisions at that position than any other because you have very few elite options, and the guys in the middle of the pack you're really going to have to look at a lot more closely. And Bucky's going to be right in the middle of it all because he truly personifies someone who has been week in, week out, consistent, but does have some flaws where he might not show up in certain games. And I'm just looking at this matchup as well as the stakes involved with it and thinking that Bucky, even with this injury and the concern surrounding that, might not get that much love from a fantasy standpoint. So that's why I feel like you might want to avoid him in this setting. And then on the Cowboys side of things, because the Cowboys are still a team, like it or not, that I still feel like adds a lot of fantasy value here. Despite the fact that, as would you start Myers or Ford, says Tyler Sperry, O'Connell is healthy. I feel like, if you're talking about Jerome Ford here, he's not necessarily someone I would rely upon in these moments, especially considering there seems to be a lot of uncertainty around the Browns as a whole offensively. But even without O'Connell, Myers could be a pivotal point for this Raiders offense. Definitely not the biggest weapon for Las Vegas, but ultimately someone who I like a lot, kind of comparable to a Jalen McMillan in terms of how reliable he can be in certain situations. So even if O'Connell does play, look for whoever is at the quarterback position for the Raiders to really key in on utilizing him in those short yardage situations, in those tight situations, maybe in the red zone to the best of their abilities, much like I suspect Jalen McMillan will try and be used in this matchup here. But thank you for your comments throughout the show, Tyler Sperry. I wish you the best of luck in your playoff matchups. Ask me for any more advice on the stretch if you so choose. But getting into the Cowboys here really quickly, I do feel like the two offensive weapons that you might want to look at as starters here and viable fantasy assets, CeeDee Lamb and Rico Dowdle. I feel like Rico Dowdle has kind of been a surprise these past couple of weeks in terms of the consistency he's added in the running game for Dallas here. I feel like they're going to utilize him a lot more down the stretch here to try and play a little bit more controlled in certain situations. So I feel like in the crucial moments that I feel like the Cowboys have lost these past couple of weeks, look for them to try and give Rico Dowdle a lot more touches in those moments. And then CeeDee Lamb, perhaps one of the most consistent fantasy wide receivers. And I feel like CeeDee Lamb, despite the fact Dak Prescott's not throwing him the football, despite the fact all these contract talks and turmoil and fallout from that might continue into this next season should the Cowboys look much like they did to start the season in the starting half of the 2025 season, then that's where maybe concerns will stem in, but he's still someone who provides so much consistency, so much production at the wide receiver position that it's tough to deny him, even with the inconsistencies we've seen almost all season long from this Cowboys offense. And I just feel like Cooper Rush is starting to really develop a nice rapport with him to the point where it can rely on him a little bit more in that setting. In terms of who to sit, and I know it's kind of tough because this Cowboys offense feels so clear-cut in intent in terms of trying to develop that balance with the run game combined with the explosiveness of a guy like CeeDee Lamb. But ultimately, I kind of feel like the more and more we see out of this Cowboys offense, the more obvious it becomes that certain players might just fall to the wayside here. And so, guys like Jake Ferguson and Cooper Rush, who were not necessarily in Jake Ferguson's regard, but definitely in Cooper Rush's, were seen as mid-season fantasy darlings, whereas a guy like Jake Ferguson really has had a very underwhelming fantasy season at the tight end position. And I feel like the reason why Cooper Rush can kind of not take the blame, so to speak, here in terms of who to sit and kind of could potentially be a fantasy sleeper and be justified in certain leagues. A guy like Jake Ferguson has no excuses because he was seen, in my opinion, as one of the most highly coveted tight ends before the season even started. But really, whether it was Dak Prescott or Cooper Rush at the quarterback position, didn't necessarily develop on last year. And I really feel kind of sorry for him because he was seen as this guy who was going to be a physical red zone threat, going to get the lion's share of targets down there, and ultimately didn't live up to that promise. And I know that the Cowboys had a lot of rotation in this offense that ultimately led to a little bit of stagnation for certain players who could have seen a lot more offensive production this season. But ultimately, Jake Ferguson is one of those players, and thus I don't necessarily see much value in starting him in these high-stakes moments, despite the fact, potentially, of your wide receiver or your tight end room being deep. And Cooper Rush, I certainly feel like in deeper leagues maybe, but not in these critical moments. But let me know what you think from my fantasy advice in the comments. But that will just about do it for today's show. This has been the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always for the GSMC Sports Network. I've been your host, Christopher Shepard. Thank you all for tuning in. We'll be back Monday the 30th. Enjoy the holidays. In the meantime, for more GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast talk, but remember, as always, like, follow, subscribe. Consider making yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features more in the new year. But other than that, I'm out for the time being. Thank you for an incredible year here at the show.